Hello. Oh, okay, no, I'm good. I'm not muted. I was like, oh shoot, I'm muted. Hi, everybody. My name's Nicole Van Tassel. Thanks for joining me today on a Sunday. If for some reason you have to leave or anything, I will be sending out a replay of this workshop in the next couple days. So that will be available to you. And also, if you just want to like go back and review something, that's available to you. As we are waiting for people to hop in, I have a lot registered, but I know it's a Sunday, so probably a lot of people are planning to watch the replay. Thank you for being here live, though. I appreciate that. If you would like to like drop in the chat a little bit, like what grade you teach, where you're from, and I will just take a minute and share a little bit more about me as well. But I would love to know, yeah, about you, where you are with phenomenon-based learning, where you're from, what grade. I see Lori is here. I know you, Lori. I don't know anybody else here, but I'm glad, at least I'm not sure I know anyone else on the list, but I'm glad you guys are here. So we have Lori is 6th grade in Minnesota. Okay, so if you don't already know me, my name is Nicole Van Tassel. I'm not sure if you found me like through my Instagram or in one of the Facebook groups I posted in. We have an 8th grade from California, Ms. Han. So I was a former middle school and high school teacher. I taught integrated science at the middle school level and then mostly earth and space science at the high school level, a little bit of like environmental science, ecology, things like that. Oh, we have from Alberta, Canada. Hi, Kathy. I taught at the high school level. I taught 9th graders for the most part. So in many ways, I still feel like that was a little bit of a middle school experience. And I definitely just personally identify more with like middle school teachers, middle school kids, middle school content. So I feel like I'm a middle school teacher at heart, but I definitely used all of these same strategies at the high school level with the 9th graders, with, I had some upper level electives, all of that. So, and anyway, that was one of the reasons I love 9th grade was because they basically act like middle school kids. So if you are from Michigan and just retired, about 47 years, oh my goodness, congratulations on 47 years and also retiring. That's exciting. So yeah, so we have a lot of middle school, it looks like, which it makes me excited because I like middle school, but I also like if you're a high school teacher, welcome, welcome. So I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. I also taught in North Carolina, but the bulk of my teaching was in Pennsylvania. I just mentioned this because Pennsylvania is not technically like an NGSS state, or our standards are in our tests and all of that are based on kind of old school kind of standards. But that doesn't mean you can't use these same phenomenon-based strategies. It doesn't mean you shouldn't. Like we really all should be teaching in this way. And I was lucky enough that I had administrators who gave me the freedom to experiment with the NGSS and these standards and 3D learning and all of that, back when they were like first released, I don't know, like 2013, 2014. And that's kind of what set me on this course toward this 3-dimensional, like phenomenon-focused exploration and discovery. There's so many terms. I've just been calling it student-owned science because I feel like that kind of embodies the students driving it. There's like a level of ownership. It's relevant, all of that. So that's what I'm calling it, student-owned science. And it's shorter and easier. We have a 5th through 8th grade teacher, 34 years and still going. Wow, that's awesome. From New Jersey. Hi, Karen. Okay, so whether you're technically an NGSS state or not, this type of instruction, it's still, I'm going to say it's the best way to do it. Obviously, we all have our own styles and we put that in as well. But building our science lessons from phenomena is really where you get that relevance, you get that engagement, and you can use it with whatever standards you have. So I would love to know if you are, so like what's your experience with either NGSS or 3D teaching? Is your state using it, or is it in transition? Are you just like, I want to do this in my classroom? You can put that in the chat too as we're going through. And yeah, we'll be talking about creating these anchored science experiences. Okay, so before we dive into like how we do this, I think it's important to understand like what the big vision is here. So why are we creating these like anchored science experiences? And this is more than just an anchor activity or a throwing phenomena in at the beginning. It's really crafting a whole experience, a whole unit, whole storyline, whatever you want to call it, around this anchor, this phenomenon. So when some of the benefits of this, like when we're building our instruction from these types of experiences, we really don't have to answer questions like, why are we learning this? Obviously, we've all gotten that question a lot, and it's really made clear and evident. And what's important here is your students have actually had a part in constructing that reason. So they don't really need to ask you because they were a part of that experience and they got to see why, they got to actually make their own meaning about why that was relevant or why this matters. So you don't get questions like, why are we learning this? Because again, they were constructing that reason with you through this anchor, and they can just go back to their own thinking about it, right? Also, when we are building our instruction from these experiences, we are setting the stage so that our students can really meet each other on a level playing field. So they've had these shared experiences to build their learning on. And it doesn't matter so much what they have or haven't experienced in their personal lives, as in terms, like, obviously we want to connect it to their personal lives, but it's not like a deficit. Like, my students have not experienced this before, so they are not bringing in this background knowledge or this prior experience or these prior thoughts. When you've created this anchor experience, all of your students are able to at least have that experience to build on. Some students might still bring more to the table, but you've given everybody a jumping off point. And then what's important about these experiences are they provide like the glue that holds all of the science content together. So over an entire unit, even not just like one class or one day. And the important thing is it's gluing that content together in our students' minds. A lot of times we go through our lessons and we think, oh, I see how yesterday's lesson connects to the next day's lesson, because we have those scientific understandings. Our students don't always have those they don't usually have those understandings. That's why they're learning from you. And so they don't always connect it in the way that we just see as, oh, duh, it connects, right? And so when all of this information is connected around your anchor phenomenon, around this science experience, it's giving students a place to root it back to. It's helping them to understand how one topic about the roles in ecosystems like decomposers and producers connects to how energy and matter is transferring. That lesson connects to the changes in an ecosystem and how the invasion of a new species impacts and messes up the whole system. Like, they can see how it all connects because it's all connecting around this one specific context. And we also know just from brain science stuff, like creating these webs in our students' brains, there's like that quote, neurons that fire together, wire together. We know that when we create these webs in our students' brains, it leads to better retention. They are able to access that information from different entry points. So overall, it's just deeper learning, longer term, learning. It's going in more into that long-term memory, that kind of stuff. And then finally, this is really what science is about. This is what scientists do. So whether our students become career scientists or not, there's value in being a scientist in your own life, right? To be able to observe, to think critically, to analyze data, and really systematically build your understanding and test your own ideas and your own thinking. So these are just general kind of life practices. But what we do when we are building science instruction from phenomena, that is literally what scientists are doing. They don't just go to a topic and say, I'm going to study fish. They notice something that happened to a fish and they say, oh, I want to figure out why that happened. So that's what we want our students to start thinking like. Not just, oh, I want to study this, but I see this happen. I want to figure that out. So anchored science experiences are built on phenomena. And when I started down this journey toward student-owned science teaching or whatever, phenomena wasn't actually on my radar. I didn't get it. I thought it was just a bunch of demos. And I felt like it didn't connect to my earth and life science kind of topics that I traditionally taught, or that were what in my curriculum, standards, grade level, whatever. So those topics I felt didn't lend to that flashbang demo kind of stuff that I saw again and again when the word phenomena was used. So I thought that it wasn't for me, and I didn't realize what phenomena actually was. And so, I mean, these flashbang kind of hooks are still not really my thing. The important thing is that phenomena are actually really fundamental to this real and relevant science and to this whole like student-owned science classroom experience. And that's what you're going to use to create your anchored science learning around. So before we move on, I just want to check this like chat we have. So we do have high school teacher, state adopted NGSS, admin still not super on board. I totally get you, Jill. And that's honestly, that seems like a lot of the teachers that I work with have been in that kind of same like states saying, hey, do this, but then there's not a lot of like PD at the district level or school level. So, and then we have somebody who is trying to do the Illinois storylines. Your students didn't like it, so you're working to incorporate, yes, some more student voice in it. That's awesome. Okay, so, and then quick question was about getting data to analyze appropriate to high schoolers. That's been a struggle. I mean, there's some data websites. I can come back to that later. A lot of times it's, you have to like dig into, I mean, just like a lot of Google. Sometimes you can pull out information and data from actual scientific studies. You just kind of have to adapt it, which again takes some time. We can come back to that question. Okay, so before we dive in too far, I would really love to know what your experience with phenomena is, like on a scale of 1 to 10. How familiar are you with the idea, with using it in your classroom? Like 1 is like, I'm not really sure, haven't really used it, totally brand new. And 5 is like, I'm using it all the time, I'm building my units on it, all of those things. And then what are some questions that you have about phenomena that you would like to see answered by the end of this workshop about, you know, that anchor phenomena, even lower level phenomena, anything like that. So as you guys share some of your questions, I do want to just mention that, like, please put your questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on it, and if it makes sense to answer it in the moment, I will go ahead and do that. But if not, we'll have some question and answer time at the end, and I'll go through those. But you don't have to wait till then to throw them in. You can like add the questions in, and I'll just scroll back through. And yeah, like I said, if you can't stay the whole time, you obviously are all registered. You'll get a replay sent to you. So, all right. So with phenomena. Okay, so we have a range of experience. So using Amplify, hoping to make it a little more relevant and hands-on. Yes, I totally understand. That's been something I've heard about the Amplify curriculum. One of the teachers I work closely with, who's a very good NGSS expert as well, she uses Amplify, and she has said kind of the same thing. Like she would like to tweak. It's nice to have that base, but she'd like to tweak some of that phenomena. Not always good in using. Yeah, it can be hard to start. It can be hard to get in the habit of even using it, right? Totally new to you. Okay. Anyway, to engage kids. Awesome. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So we will totally talk about like where you can find phenomena. Yeah, bringing in that student voice and choice. Exactly. Start using them. Just put off the start of our new curriculum by a year this week. I'm writing to start using. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so sweet. I'm glad that we have like a range. Because of that, I do want to just do a quick review, but I'm glad a lot of you are already familiar with the idea. So just so we're on the same page though. So phenomena are the events or processes that happen in the natural world. So it's a pretty simple explanation, but when I work with educators, there's this real struggle to understand like what phenomena you should or like even could be using, and then obviously how to use it is even trickier. So I've been there and everything. And it does just take time, and then like you get to a point where just like, oh my gosh, I've been using it wrong the whole time or whatever, and then you're like, darn, gotta start doing it the right way. And that's totally normal, and that's happened to me a bazillion times for different 3D teaching related things. But the important thing is when we're talking about phenomenon-based science, it's what's happening in the natural world. So out in the real world, not in your classroom, not the experiences you create and contrive. Those things do have a place in your science instruction. Like there is definitely, you still want to be doing that. But when we're talking about what are you building your units on, when we're talking about how am I going to really engage my students, it's not the lab that you do for 30 minutes or 1 or 2 days or whatever in your classroom. It's like the big real world problem or issue or thing that happened that adds that relevance and that engagement. So we want our students to investigate real world happenings, take those, ask questions, get curious, and then you bring them into your classroom and you do those lower level, like not as in lower level, like less thinking, but lower level as in like smaller and focus in class activities. But the important thing, so things that happen in the real world. And this is what takes that like just textbook kind of science, I'm going to spit facts at you, into like real authentic science learning. So a couple other things about phenomena, it's something that your students can explain as they develop their science knowledge. So they cannot look at it and tell you all about it and explain why it's happening. I mean, it could be a phenomenon, but it's not a good one if they can do that. It is something that they might understand parts of it, and over time they understand more and more and more. And then by the end of the unit, they should have a really strong understanding of like, I can explain why a lot of those things happen. They still might have some questions, and that's great. We want them to always have more questions, but it's something that happened. I don't know why that happened. I don't know what's causing it. I'm not sure. I mean, there's just whatever questions relate to it. And then over time throughout your unit, they are answering those questions. And again, when your instruction is rooted in this phenomena, it's giving your content meaning, it's giving your content a context, and it leads to just better engagement, better retention, that curiosity, wonder, that's what makes our students want to learn, because ultimately we want our students to want to learn. So again, you don't have to answer that like, why are we learning this? It's just very evident when you're using that phenomena. A couple of things about phenomena, it's specific. So we'll get to this in a second, but it's observable and it's a moment in time. And this is where I think a lot of times we think a little bit too vague with some phenomena. Like climate change like anthropogenic climate change right now is a phenomenon. It is a moment in time, but it's a little bit too big, and it's more of a concept. Like the climate is changing, that's a concept. However, if you were to zoom in just a little bit, like sea level rise in this community over the last 5 years, that's a moment in time. That's observable. They can see the sea level has risen by looking at data or by looking at photos or whatever. And it's specific. So that's an example of an example of phenomena, something that happens in the real world. And then you would do activities in the classroom to bring it in. Okay, so what you want to think about is like how we are typically starting our units, and are you starting with phenomena? So right now, I guess, like if you guys want to share in the chat, like, are you already using phenomena to root your units in or your science content around? Again, you can drop those ideas. Jill says she's working on creating a unit from scratch around ocean acidification. She's not sure how to actually pull it together. I gotcha. Now, when I first started using phenomena, so I realized I was doing like the exploration, I was doing the 3D science practices and all of that, but I was not using phenomena when I was like first making this like transition. I got those pieces in place, and then I realized, hey, I'm still just teaching the content. I'm teaching those like, let's do a lab about convection, and we can use our science practices and we can figure it out and make those connections. I was doing that stuff, but I wasn't rooting it in like a real world thing. So then I started bringing phenomena into my instruction, but it pretty much was like used at the beginning of the unit, and then eventually it was used at the end. So it kind of like bookended, but that was kind of the extent of it. And it was kind of here's the phenomenon. This is why the unit stuff is important. And then we went into the normal stuff. When I was actually planning, what I did is I looked at my standards, I looked at my topics, and then I had that all mapped out. And I said, what's a real world example of this? Oh, we're learning convection. We're learning layers of the earth. Okay, earthquakes, right? I'm going to go pick an earthquake. So we'd read about, that San Francisco earthquake in 1906, or we'd watch a video about really bad algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. They were my real world examples. I thought like that was enough to kind of root or anchor my units and to show students that it was important and relate it to the real world. And that's why you should learn this and all of that. But I didn't really return to the phenomenon very often. And like I said, sometimes I just threw it on at the end as like a bookend. But either way, it really wasn't like a central feature of my unit. It wasn't driving the flow of my storyline. It wasn't what my science instruction was really built on. It wasn't built on solving that or explaining that. And so my students struggled to see how the ideas connected from like lesson to lesson and why it actually mattered. Even though I could say, oh, but wait, remember those algae blooms? Like, remember that earthquake? That's why it's important. It didn't really like sink in or connect to them because they didn't really care about explaining that. I hadn't really created an experience that they were like, oh, this really matters. And I want to figure that algae bloom out. It was more like, here's our unit stuff. And this is why that's important. And you should make the connection. So I was making progress, but I was not like there. So you might have like used phenomena in this way, or you might be in this stage, or even if like a colleague is, if you aren't even here yet, like it's doesn't matter. I mean, we're all just moving through this transition at like our own pace. So I just want to let you know that like you don't have to go full on and build your entire units around a phenomena if you are just getting started with this, and because that might seem really overwhelming. That said, if you want to do that, like go for it. But we are all just in different places. Very few of us, I feel like, went through like a school system where we saw this happen in our science classes. I didn't just wake up and like know how to teach in this way. And we really haven't seen it modeled for us. So it's just something to remember, like wherever you are right now is fine. I guess that's the point. Not consistent, better with earth science than in chemistry. Chemistry is like, I feel like a tricky one to really embrace that phenomena. Earth science, I feel like is an easy one because it's the earth, right? Everything is. But anyway, wherever you are, it's totally okay. Okay, so I was presenting my phenomena at the beginning of the unit, throwing it in again at the end, and it wasn't really a central feature. Now, when I started working with phenomena, my experience, like I said, it was like, here's an example and here's how it works. So I would give them, the 1906 earthquake, and we would read about earthquakes and how they happen and what happens or whatever. Or we'd read about the algae bloom and we would read about like what was causing it. And my goal with that type of presentation of my phenomena was that, this is important to the real world. And it proved that, but it also didn't spark learning, which was the whole point of using the phenomena. It couldn't be used to drive instruction when I was presenting it in that way, because there weren't any questions left to answer. I gave them the phenomenon and I gave them the explanation. And then I was like, okay, now we're going to dive deeper into this explanation. But nobody cares at that point because you're like, you told me the answer. I don't need to read any further. I don't need to figure out anymore. And so that really is why it didn't work. If you have tried using phenomena and had it fall flat, it's something to consider. Like, could that help explain the experience? Did you really explain too much about the phenomenon? It's also possible that it wasn't relevant to your students, which is another factor. But the thing is, a lot of times I think when we do start using phenomena, when we do start using those relevant real world examples, we like over explain, we over teach it. But when if you think about like our own lives and our own desires to learn, our own curiosity, like when there's ambiguity, there's curiosity. We want to figure it out. When you see that, what's it called? When you see a headline, the clickbait headlines or whatever, and they're all like ambiguous and you're like, what are they talking about? You want to click it to like see what's there. And then you read the first like 3 lines and you're like, okay, I know that. And then you leave, right? You don't actually care. It's why newspapers give like a synopsis in the first paragraph, because usually we like get the first paragraph and then unless it's really interesting to us, we probably don't read any further. We got like our answer to whatever encouraged us to click on that in the first place. So when we keep that in mind in this like human habit or whatever, we want to think like, what does that mean for your phenomena? So the gist is that we don't start our instruction with the answers. We don't give the answer, give the explanation of the phenomenon when we're presenting it at the beginning of the unit. So looking back on like my own planning, I would look at I found interesting things, right? An interesting historical event, the San Francisco earthquakes, interesting facts about an ecosystem, something interesting that happened. I've seen some teachers, weird facts about this weird creature. And that was their phenomenon because they didn't truly understand like what a phenomenon was. My algae blooms example, like here's a weird thing that happened and here's why it happened a little bit, how it happened. And then that's why this unit matters. And these things are interesting. They make you go like, oh, but we actually want our students to look at our phenomenon and ask like, wait, like what? Let me find out more. Tell me more. So you really want ambiguity when you're presenting a phenomenon. The key is that you want to like avoid giving the answers. So if you are starting a unit, about ocean acidification, you are going to find some example of like some viewable, observable, visible example of ocean acidification and not explain it, just so that your students are asking, what's causing this? Why is this happening? Can I make it happen? Can I stop it from happening? Is it going to happen here? If it happened there, is it going to happen here? We want to stop putting the answers to the phenomena when we present our phenomena. So I recently read this study where these like two groups of preschoolers were given this experimental box and it had two levers, and the one group, the children and the adults pressed the levers at the same time, and this like duck and a puppet popped out of the box. And it really wasn't clear to the preschoolers what caused the puppet and the duck to pop up. Was it one lever? Was it the other lever? Did you have to press both at the same time? Did it matter if the grown-up pressed it? Would it do it if I just pressed it? Like nobody knew. In the second group, they had the children and the adults alternating pressing the levers, and whatever sequence they did, it was just very clear that it was like the one lever that caused the puppet to pop up and the other lever caused the duck to pop up. So these researchers then left the room and they just like examined what these kids did. What were the kids going to decide to play with? Would they keep playing with this experimental box and like making it pop up, or would they move on to just this other novel toy that was like sitting in the room? And they found that the group of children who didn't know the answers were way more likely to continue exploring the box, and they spent a lot more time playing with the box, the experimental box, than with the new toy. Whereas the group that the children could see exactly how it worked before the adults even left, those children pretty much just reached for the novel toy and then played with the novel toy longer. So the gist is like, because they knew how it worked, they weren't interested anymore. And those are preschoolers, but the same goes to our like middle and high school students, and even ourselves as adults, right? We get curious about something. Once you have an answer, you don't really think about it again, right? If you think about even those weird brain teaser puzzles where you have to like figure out how to unclip two shapes or like two metal things or whatever, once you figure, like you might be really into trying to figure it out. You get them at Christmas time or whatever, holidays. You may be really interested in trying to figure it out. But as soon as you figure it out, you don't ever really feel that need to go back and do it again, right? It's like, I know how it works now, I'm done. I mean, that's the same thing for our students. So when we present our phenomena, like this is what happened, this is how it worked. Okay, now let's get in depth into this stuff. You already gave them the answers. They're really not curious anymore. And unless it's something they are just already wildly passionate about, they're not really going to be that intrinsically motivated to continue investing their time and energy and understanding what's happening. Obviously, they might do it for the grades. They might do it because their parents say so. They might do it because they like you. But in terms of their intrinsic motivation to learn, you kind of already got rid of the curiosity. And so that drive is not as strong as it could be. So here's what happens if we rethink that? What if you took the same phenomenon, but you kept it super ambiguous? You didn't explain what's causing it. You don't explain why does it happen, or how can I make it happen, or any of those things. You just leave them wondering all of those questions, like those kids with the experimental box, like what caused it? What happened there? Was it both levers, one lever? Can I test these ideas? Does it matter if I press it, or if my neighbor presses it, or if my mom presses it? You just keep it really ambiguous. And now we can actually use that to drive our students' learning. And we can use those questions to keep them hooked and engaged and actively learning throughout the entire unit. Because they've developed those questions, they are invested in answering those questions. And then it's just a matter of us guiding their learning to answer those questions. We've really cultivated a curiosity, and that is a really powerful drive for learning. It makes it a lot easier in your class, in your it just makes it a lot easier in your class to get your students to truly actively engage with their minds, working hard, persisting through the struggle of figuring things out, because sometimes that can be hard too. They have that drive to do that. And it's an internal intrinsic drive. So it's more powerful than being, again, motivated by a grade or their neighbor or competition or whatever. So on the flip side, like once they have the explanation, they don't really need to listen anymore. They don't really care. They just say like, oh, that was interesting. And then they move on. So there's that quote also. So there's a quote here. If you're curious, there's always something new to be discovered in the backdrop of your daily life. And I feel like the more I have worked to bring curiosity into my science lessons, I am more curious about my own world and about things that happen and about even interactions with people, like interpersonal kind of things. It impacts everything in your life if we can cultivate this curiosity for our students and for ourselves. But there's also a quote from George R.R. Martin, and it's, why is it when one person builds a wall, the next man immediately needs to know what's on the other side? Curiosity is literally like an itch you have to scratch. People have done research on it. It's in this information gap. We know there's something. We don't know what that something is, and we like really want to know what it is. And we're kind of dying to know. And so that's what we want to create with our students, and that's what Phenomena does. And research has even found that there's an intrinsic reward to curiosity, like biologically. Your limbic reward system in your brain like lights up every time you have that like information gap and you're curious. And so this actually increases your ability to learn and to retain information. So even if you are like, it's really hard to make, kids curious, and I can get them to do the tasks, I can get them to do the work even without that, you're actually increasing their ability to learn and to retain that information when you first spark the curiosity. We're just more likely to remember information sought out from curiosity than information that was just passed to us. And so it's a really good teaching tool to be using in our classroom, and Phenomena is the way that we do that. And how we present Phenomena is also the way that we do that. So you can see it's not just like phenomena in general, but it's how we present our phenomena and how we build these like anger experiences. I do want to do a quick side note, like choosing your phenomena is very important as well. It's important that you're choosing the phenomena for the students you have. So some of you mentioned in the chat, like that you had experience with other units and that the phenomena used in those other units just didn't connect to your students. It doesn't mean that your students can't do this. It doesn't mean you even did anything wrong or anything like that. It might just not be the right phenomenon for your students. And that's not really what this workshop is about. So I don't want to go too far into that. I do have an on-demand workshop on my site called Foundations of Authentic Engagement. I can send you the link if you are interested in looking into that workshop. But I do want to just note that you do have to keep in mind your own students and what's going to be relevant and engaging for them when you're choosing your phenomenon. And if you have a phenomenon that doesn't work, it's okay. You might just need to pick a different one next time, right? Okay, but we do need to consider, how are we anchoring our units? And are we using phenomena at all? Is it relevant and engaging phenomena? Are you just bookending it, where you just put it at the beginning, you put it at the end, you don't really come back to it in the middle? Or is it something that your entire unit is actually structured around? You also want to think about, how are you presenting it? Are your students left with those questions at the end of your anchor experience? Or are they just left with the like, and like, that's that, they're done. So we want to make sure that our anchor is creating that curiosity that is driving our learning forward. And it's not just this like, see, I told you this science is relevant strategy. So these are just some questions and ideas that you want to reflect on, like as honestly as you can, and there's some spaces in your workbook to do that at your convenience. But we're going to get into like looking at planning. So remember, when you're presenting your phenomena, keep in mind, and if you're just joining us, I will be sending out a replay, but as you're presenting your phenomena and you're actually crafting your, activity, you just want to keep in mind, like, am I over explaining? How am I presenting this phenomena? Is it leading to questions, or is it just leading to like answers and like, that's interesting. So we are going to get into planning now, and how we launch instructional sequences with phenomena. We know that how we present our phenomena matters, but how do we actually plan all of this out? So that's what we're going to be talking about now. Okay. So like I said, in the past, my approach was really to like look at my standards and my topics. I had my overall plan, like that was kind of already done. Maybe it was like following the textbook a little bit. Maybe it was following just the typical sequence that my district gave me. And then I would find the real world example and I would just put it in there, just throw it in there. So if you are in this stage, it's not bad. It's still progress because you are bringing phenomena into your storylines, and that's great. But we do want to take it further. And the problem with this type of approach to planning, so I just posted on my Instagram stories, like, how do you approach planning? Do you start with the topics or the standards, or do you start with the phenomena? And for a long time, I was a start with the topics and the standards. But the problem with that is that it ends up being like this addendum. Like, phenomenon is just the phenomenon that you chose. It might be a really great phenomenon. You might actually present it really well, but it's still just this like afterthought that you added in. And so we might be aiming to incorporate it in a greater extent, but because it was an addition from the beginning, our unit really isn't built on it. We're always working really hard to find the connection back, and the connections back don't always seem that relevant or like a easy to make because we didn't start with it, because we had our plan mapped out and then we added the phenomenon in afterward. And so they don't come easy. It's hard to remember to go back to it, and it just doesn't happen, right? We set ourselves up from the beginning to make it really difficult when this actually doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be difficult. When you build your unit from the phenomenon first, those connections flow and they're easy to come back to, and it's easy for your students. So what can we do instead? All right, so run through this with me. And then I'm going to, if you were just like, but I have all of these standards I have to cover and I have to do them in this order and they were broken down into quarters for me or whatever, just we'll get there too. But what can we do instead? We can start with our phenomenon first. So we are going to set aside the topics and the standards and all of the facts and figures that you know you're supposed to teach, and you just pick a phenomenon first. And if you're freaking out a little bit, that's okay. Is anybody freaking out a little bit? Are you like, but I do have all of these standards, so how am I supposed to do that? And it's okay if you are. Maybe you're like, I don't have that freedom. I have people telling you, but maybe you do have freedom. Also, I'm curious. Does anybody, like, where are you guys in that level of freedom? Because I've been in schools where they're just like, I don't care what you teach, go teach anything. And then I've been in schools where they're like, you have to teach this in quarter 1 and this in quarter 2 and these standards in quarter 3, and they're going to take this test in second quarter or whatever. So I've been like across the boat. We can put in the chat where you are. I'm always a little curious what the range is. But anyway, I'm going to give you some structure on if you are in the like not so free with your curriculum group. We'll talk about what you can do there. But I do want to talk about what the possibility is if you do have the freedom, if it is possible for you. What would an ideal science class in an ideal science world look like if it was rooted on like phenomena? Okay, so we have Jill has pretty free reign. It's just the state standards and you can order and arrange. So that's actually a really nice balance. I'm super not anti-standards. I like standards, right? But but it is nice when you have the freedom. Okay, so this is what could happen if you did have the freedom to set up your science units like however you want it. You could find a cool phenomenon, something that's going to be relevant to your students, relevant to your community, something that's relevant to the world right now. So maybe it's like the crazy storms that happened in Texas just a couple months ago. I don't know. Time is weird right now. So it might have been 2 months ago. It might have been 3 weeks ago. I'm not really sure. It could have been, a big hurricane that happened last year. It could be an invasive species that's impacting your region and maybe impacting your local ecosystems or like your economy or both. It could be sea level rise in your town, the rumblings of an impending earthquake, that's in the news, poisoned water from lead pipes, how many ever years ago that was. It could be a virus tearing through our whole world, right? We want to find something that is relevant, that's happening in the real world, and that our students would be really curious about. So that would be their starting point in this, remember, ideal science world. Then you take that phenomenon and you ask, what questions is this going to spark? What science ideas help us understand and explain it? And then what standards connect to those? So you have your phenomenon first, and then you come up with your questions, you come up with your ideas that would be sparked from that phenomenon. And then you look at your standards and you decide, oh, this is a strong tie to that standard. I can bring that into this unit. It may be a loose tie to this standard, but I can tie it in and I can definitely flow into that. And that's how you have your starting point, and that's how you have your bundle of standards for your unit. And you might have 3 to 5 standards in your unit. Typically you have, I think it's easiest when you're just starting to limit yourself to about 3, and maybe you touch on another one. I think if you get beyond 3, it gets a little bit more complicated. 3 to 5 is maybe 6 would maybe be like the max. I would not probably put more than 6. I prefer the 3 to 5 range. But again, I didn't start creating units with 3 to 5 with 5 standards. I started with like 2 to 3 standards. But the thing is, because you're explaining this real world happening, it usually goes beyond one standard. You usually can't explain those storms in Texas by only looking at weather. Climate also plays a role. Or you can't explain that invasive species impact in your community only by looking at food webs and matter and energy. You also need to look at, the changes in the ecosystem or the roles of organisms in that ecosystem. So because you're starting with a phenomena, you can easily create those bundles and they easily tie together, and it's engaging for your students. They want to figure out, because remember, you presented it in a way that sparked that curiosity. They want to figure out all of those answers, and they want to basically learn your standards, right? They want to learn that stuff you were supposed to teach them anyway. Now, let's say so anyway, this is really how scientists do it. And we're going to talk about if you are a little bit less free in your approach. But this is basically how scientists do it, right? They don't go out with a checklist of standards that they have to go through and have to review and have to study. They see something happen, they wonder about it, and then they investigate. So this really reflects how our students could be learning science, right? They could be learning scientists like scientists do science. I mean, if you think about oftentimes, science classes look like our students are learning about science. But if you think about it, like, do baseball players learn about baseball to become baseball players, or do they just like learn to play baseball? They just play baseball. So we want our students to not be learning about science. We want them to be like learning to do science or doing science. So we want them to be doing what scientists do. That's why when you start with standards when you start with phenomena first, you can really reflect that process for your students. But I know some of you do not have that freedom. So what do you do there? Okay, so yeah, so we have somebody who said, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I don't want to butcher your name, Mel. I don't want to mess it up. So I don't even want to say it because I feel like that. I'm sorry. Okay, so okay. But she said that some of the storylines that she did she's probably trying to cover too many standards with the phenomena, right? So sometimes it can be really hard when you're trying to connect like 5 or 6 standards to one phenomenon. Where if you start with 3-ish, that's good. But like, let's say you don't have that freedom. You're like, these are the standards I have to cover in a quarter, and I can't just go like willy-nilly choosing whatever I want based on whatever phenomenon I find interesting. So what's your approach? And I know this is probably the case for most of you. So you can still, we live in an education system that's filled with standards, and that's what it is, right? So you can still use this phenomenon-based approach even when you have a little bit more structure to the way your curriculum is organized. So what I found really helpful here is that I picked like a focus standard, and it might be 2 focus standards if you can find 2 that connect really well together. And these are the core of my unit. And I use these 2 standards to help me select a phenomenon. So if I was looking at like MSLS 1-4, which has to do with how characteristic animal behaviors and specialized plant structures affect the probability of successful reproduction, it's like looking at pollination and stuff like that, right? And then I look also at MSLS 2-2, explanation that predicts patterns of interactions among organisms across multiple ecosystems. Those are 2 standards that I just look at right off the bat, and I'm like, I can connect those 2 really easily, I think. There's not a lot of stretch if I pick the right phenomenon to join those two together. So then I asked myself, like, what questions do these standards answer? And I dive into the evidence statements to help me. I look at the disciplinary core ideas, and I basically turn those statements into questions. So it's like, these are the disciplinary core ideas, the evidence statements are kind of like your objectives, like what you want your students to know and do. And I just think, if I was asking a question that was answering, what would the question be? And then once I have those questions, I ask myself, what's happening outside there that ties to these ideas? So this is where, like, choosing your phenomena, right? First of all, I use a lot of just my own science experience and knowledge to think about examples that I've seen, case studies, scenarios that have happened in the world. I don't have to be super specific at this point. I just have to have some kind of starting point, right? And if it is a topic I am totally unfamiliar with, I just go and I start browsing some news websites and I see what I come across. So I look at those two. I'm like, plant structures, animals, reproduction, ecosystem roles. And I mean, I remember learning about bees, right? And beehive decline. Bees are pollinators and beehive decline. And their connection to agriculture. Okay, now I have a general topic. I have a general idea. And that is going to be my starting point. But I do still need to find like a specific phenomenon, like my moment in time, my specific instance or example. And that is where it takes, like, you might be like, okay, my students are probably not going to be interested in bees, but this is where you can get into the engaging and the relevance and connecting it to their experience and all of that. So I also like to turn to the web at this point, if I haven't already, and I start browsing science news sites again. Sometimes they're regular news sites. Also just different organizations and projects they have going on, or what people are talking about. In the Teaching Science in 3D podcast that I do with Erin Sadler, she mentioned she really likes going into local Facebook groups, and she finds like what people are talking and complaining about. So her community was experiencing this like a significant rise in the coyote population, and people were talking about, oh my gosh, my dogs are getting eaten. That's not really a good thing. I mean, as a joke, but they were worried about their dogs and these coyotes, or their pets and these coyotes. And so she used that as a phenomenon for one of her units. So what people are talking about, things that are happening. And I look for my specific instance. So I would go to a science news website and I would search like bees, pollination, pollinator decline, anything like that. And what I want to find is like a specific example. It could be a specific activity, an investigation, something where our students can see the issue at hand, like a set of data, something that's an unknown problem or a puzzle, or just this event that happened that's kind of weird. And that is where I really choose my phenomenon, that one thing that they're going to have to explain. So for example, when I was doing my bee search, right, I found that there was this article that talked about collectors find plenty of bees, but far fewer species than in the 1950s. So I'm like, okay, I can use this. I know I can create some kind of like some sort of data analysis activity. I know we have this news article. And I know I'm going to have to add more to that to like really tie into students' relevance and their lives and all of that, but it's my starting point. So I think, what questions is this going to spark? They're going to ask things like, why are there fewer species and what's causing that decline? And why does this matter? Why are bees important? What do they do? How does pollination actually work? What are some solutions to this problem? Are there solutions? Do we really know what's causing this problem? So I have my phenomena. And then I get into the presentation. How am I going to present this in a way that's going to spark those questions? So like I said, I know I can definitely do some sort of data analysis thing. Maybe I can pull it right from this news article. Maybe they could read this news article. Maybe, however, I do need to remove some of the information. Maybe I only give them the headline. Maybe I give them a couple paragraphs of the text. Maybe it's just the data. Maybe I can create a different activity, like a clue or an unfolding mystery type of thing. I've done activities like that where it's like, this is all of the data, but I'm going to give it to them in pieces so that they are over time learning a little bit more and asking more questions and putting those pieces together. Maybe it's an actual experience. And this is, again, a great way to get into that, tying it to their lives. So it's going out and cataloging pollinators that they find in the schoolyard. Maybe it is, if you're doing, I'm working on something on compost and ecosystem and like roles and human population and things like that. Maybe it's like doing a waste audit and looking at how much waste do you actually produce and how is that part of this bigger global problem. So what can you do to add on to this like first article that will expand it into a true experience? And this is why I like to call, in the past, I've thought about anchors as just like this one activity or this one example or this one data set, but I think you get more engagement when you create an experience by integrating a couple of different activities around this one central problem. So my goal always is to spark these questions without answering them. So I have my general idea. I have those initial questions. I do want to go back to my standards and think, is there anything else that would connect? Are there any questions that this standard doesn't answer that another one that, questions that relate to another standard basically? And if so, like, perfect, let's bring that into the bundle. And that is again, where when you're starting with a bundle of standards, it can be really hard to find a phenomena that connects to all of them. But if you start with one or two standards and you find the phenomena that's perfect to it, you can think about what other things might my students ask, and then you can bring in those additional standards in that way. So yeah, are there any other science ideas that would like flesh out this picture or give it a better understanding? When I think about like the compost thing, so human populations, it's trash, it's food waste, it's what happens when things decompose, matter and energy in ecosystems, but also, hey, food waste is a problem for like climate change. So maybe I can bring in some of that climate change standards as well, and like why this matters, why it matters that our food's going to a landfill and creating methane versus breaking down in your backyard and going back into the soil. So that's where you can bring in some of those extra standards. And then lastly, I don't want to say lastly because this is a really important piece, but you again want to come back to their lives and their communities and their values. And that should always kind of be in the back of your head too. As you're choosing your initial, like your phenomenon from the get-go, you want to think about, is there a way that like, will my students be interested in this? Can I connect them to this? And if you think that I think I can, or I think I can make it relevant, or I think they would relate in this way or that way, then you want to just take it one step further. But by the end, what hands-on experiences can you add in? What human stories or human emotions, human like experiences can you add in to create that like long-term engagement and interest? So I found a lot of times when we think about phenomena, we rely on novelty. Novelty wears off really fast. But if you go to relevance, like this is important to me right now in my life, or emotion, like this stirs my like anger, like at the injustice of it, or this connects to me because I have felt those same emotions about losing my home. Maybe it's not because of climate change, but I've gone through that experience. I can relate to that. I've had somebody who's gotten sick from a disease like this. And so I can relate to those families who experienced that pollution and suffered because of it. Like that goes a long way toward inspiring your like long-term engagement and interest, and going beyond the just like, oh, that's interesting, or that's novel and new, and I'm kind of curious. When you can add that really relevance and emotion, it lasts longer. So I think like, how can I make this issue, bees, their decline, their importance, this whole puzzle about the bees, how can I make it into their issue? How can I engage them in that like authentic, real science work? And so the answers to these questions take my anchor experience like a step further from just this general scientific issue or problem or puzzle to actually something that's really relevant to like my students and their lives and their futures. And then I just flesh out my studies. I map out the branches to create these like simple storylines and create that structure. And yet it's still within this space where the students can drive their learning because, okay, this is my phenomenon. I'm anticipating they're going to ask these questions. And now I'm going to take it a little bit further. I'm anticipate, and they can take it in different directions. You don't know. They might ask some other questions and you can decide what you want to do with that. But you can then go, these are the questions that they're going to ask. These are the activities that I can help them work through to answer those questions, but you're also responsive to them because they are the ones that initially created those questions as far as they know, right? You have it in your head. I think they're going to ask these questions. I think it's going to go in this direction, but you are also allowing it to unfold in the way that they want it to go. I think one of the problems with a lot of like canned curriculum is that it's this question and then it's the next question and then it's the next question and then it's the next question. And it's a lot like textbooks, where this is the order that we think it should go in. But a lot of times we can, if we open ourselves up to saying, okay, this is a question and I have these activities that go with this question, so I can help my students figure this question out. That's good planning. Do that. But if you can be open to, well, maybe we'll do this question first, or if they seem really interested in this other question, maybe they could go into the other question first. And eventually you can guide them back around to, if you have 5 questions as part of your unit, you can guide them back to some of those other questions, or they'll discover, hey, in order to fully answer this question, I actually have to answer that other one first. But you're really opening it up so that it is students that are driving the learning. You've kind of mapped out the general potential pathways that they could move down, these like mini storylines within that larger storyline. But the order that you put them on, it's possible for your students to actually be the ones driving that experience. And I have shared this story before, like a lot of times, but I'm going to share it again really quick because I think a lot of times we think, but they have to know these basics first, but they have to know this first, right? Okay, there's an episode of Big Bang Theory, really quick with me. Sheldon is trying to teach Penny physics, and Penny is like, I just want to know what my boyfriend does. Sheldon tries to go into a whole textbook definition of it. And finally, like Penny is just crying, doesn't know what's going on, is totally lost, feels dumb, all of the things. And Sheldon finally breaks down and is like, Leonard is studying how subatomic particles move. And she's like, oh, okay. And then she realizes, but wait, what are subatomic particles? And so Sheldon, I don't know, he tries to go back to the beginning of physics, but that's not a great approach. What you want to do is, like, you might think, I can't tell my students what subatomic particles are because they have to know all of these other things. But if you answered, so like, let's just follow this train of thought. You tell them what subatomic particles are because that's what they asked. They figure out what subatomic particles are, and then they realize, like, wait, but what are atoms? So they're going to come back to the things they need to know because they're going to realize, I don't understand what subatomic particles are if I don't understand what atoms are. So I only say that as I just want you to question, do my students really need to know these basics, or will they realize the pieces of information that they're missing will they realize what they're missing if I let them go in this direction? So it's just something to consider. Sometimes maybe you are like, no, they really need to know this basic, and that's okay. Like, that's okay too. But a lot of times we just assume they need to know the basics when potentially they might not actually need to know that. Okay, so we're wrapping up. We are going to have some time for questions. So I see some questions popping up and I'll answer those. I just really want to encourage you to really shift your thinking away from checking off your standards towards like actually investigating phenomena as you plan your lessons and you design your curriculum. So we want to leave space in our units for our students to question and to drive the learning forward so that we don't have the entire unit fully mapped out. Like, this is day 1, this is day 2, this is day 3. And instead, we have, these are the activities that I'm going to pair with this question. And this is another question I think we're going to need to answer. And these are some activities, or these are some things that my students can move through to get there. But we can also be responsive to, my students are really interested in this question right now, and I'm going to go with it. And then we're going to come back and circle back around to this other question. So that's really what allowing your students to drive their learning experiences and like build from these anchored experiences is about. And before I understood these things. I really struggled with like student engagement. I didn't get why didn't they care? Why weren't they curious? Why didn't they see how like cool this stuff was? I burnt myself out on those like late nights planning and replanning and using grades to hold students accountable and fighting for their attention in class and all of that. Like I totally get you if you're feeling that. And I also think it's a totally different world right now. And that's another level if you're teaching virtually or all of that. But when I started to rethink the approach, that's when I saw the difference in my classroom and with my own students, and even with my own, like satisfaction and like sense of achievement of what I was doing in the classroom. So I really hope that this workshop sparks some of those ideas for you. Okay, okay, Kathy, thanks so much. And yeah, you can definitely like catch up on the question and answers and all of that. But we are pretty much done. So I'm glad you're able to stay the whole time. Jill, I'll come back to your question in 1 second. I do just want to invite you. I'm working on something for the fall. It's called Spark Subscription. And basically my goal is to help like middle school teachers specifically create these like anchored experiences. It's going to start for real in August, but I'm looking for basically some guinea pigs to give me some feedback. There's no cost for this feedback. Or there's like no cost to like try this stuff out. So basically what the Spark subscription is going to include, it's going to be this like anchored science experience, some suggestions or like ideas of these pathways you could follow, potentially like a few activities to support you along these different pathways. So like some lessons, some activities, and then an assessment project that is really built from the initial anchor and addresses the like focus standards. So I'm really just looking for a couple of teachers who might be interested in trying this out in like May and June and providing some feedback. It's not going to necessarily be like the whole big kit and caboodle, but it'll be some pieces of it. And I would just love just to get some feedback. So on the structure and things like that. So if you're interested in trying it out, you can actually go to iExploreScience.com/spark and just register there. And then once the first set of resources is done in like early May, I'll just send it to you and I'll give you information on how you can provide that feedback. You can also like Instagram, message me or Facebook or whatever. But again, there's no like fee or anything like that for the trial. It's just putting your email address in, and then I'll send you the resources when it's ready. And I would just like your feedback on it. But anyway, if you have questions about that whole thing, let me know. But now we can answer your questions. So one of the first ones. So Jill, Lori, awesome. That sounds awesome. If you just want to sign up there, then I won't forget. But if you don't do that and I forget, just reach out again. So like add you to the list. But okay, so how do you plan the phenomenon intro to lead the kids to the questions you need to cover based on your standards?